Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Secrets, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight we begin with something colder than your ex's heart and twice as damp, a medieval Halloween. Forget plastic skeletons and pumpkin spice lattes. 700 years ago, October 31st wasn't about sugar comas. It was about surviving the night without being haunted, cursed, or mildly stabbed by your superstitious neighbor. So, blow out your candle, adjust your hay-filled pillow, and let's time travel to when fear was hand-carved and slightly unsanitary. Back then, Halloween wasn't even called Halloween. It was All Hallows' Eve, the eve before All Saints' Day, and it sat neatly wedged between religion and panic. The church wanted prayers, peasants wanted protection, and somewhere in the middle, everyone wanted an excuse to stay up late and drink something fermented enough to count as courage. Picture it, mist clinging to the thatched roofs, the air heavy with wood smoke and sheep-related odors. In the distance, a church bell tolls, the kind of sound that makes you reconsider your life choices. Children whisper stories about wandering souls. Dogs bark at nothing, or maybe something that doesn't quite count as nothing. The night feels alive, and not in a good way. To keep the dead from dropping by uninvited, villagers lit enormous bonfires, the medieval version of Do Not Disturb. Sparks flew upward like frantic prayers, and smoke curled across the fields to confuse anything lurking in the dark. Some families left bowls of porridge or bread outside for the souls of the departed, an ancient, spooky room service. The logic was simple. Feed the dead so they don't feed on you. And because this was medieval Europe, everything had rules. You couldn't just ignore the spirits. If you didn't light your candle, if you forgot your prayer, or heaven forbid if you laughed too loudly during Vespers, well, enjoy being mildly possessed until next harvest. The funniest part? Nobody really agreed on what the dead wanted. Some thought they were friendly relatives stopping by to check if you'd married yet. Others swore they were demons wearing grandma's face. The safest strategy was to assume both and offer bread and an exorcism. Meanwhile, the local priest reminded everyone that fear was character building. Don't be afraid of ghosts, he'd say. Be afraid of damnation, which frankly sounds worse. But despite all the dread, there was comfort in the chaos. The flicker of torches, the soft chanting, the laughter around the fires. It all said the same thing. We're still here. We made it through another harvest, another year, another night that smelled faintly of turnips and doom. So, as you lie there now, under your modern blanket instead of a questionable wool sack, imagine that world, the silence before the wind picks up, the taste of smoke on the air, the uneasy joy of being alive in a time when death was only a doorway away, and everyone could still hear the knocking. And remember, if you enjoy falling asleep to history's darker corners, tap that like button gently, the way a polite ghost might knock before entering. Subscribe, too, so you can join us next week when we find new ways to make terror strangely comforting. Now, let's step further into the fog, because in medieval Europe, even the pumpkins were haunted. You know a civilization is having a rough time when the dead start making surprise appearances. In the Middle Ages, rest in peace was less of a promise and more of a polite suggestion. People back then didn't see death as final. It was more like a gap year. You'd die, hang around, haunt a few loved ones, then hopefully move on once someone prayed enough on your behalf. But not everyone got the memo. Some souls, it seemed, just stayed. They called them revenants, the returned dead. Sometimes they were described as pale figures wandering graveyards. Other times they were alarmingly physical, like your deceased neighbor suddenly showing up to borrow flour again. Medieval chronicles mention entire villages tormented by these undead visitors, who had the irritating habit of coughing loudly near windows and spreading plague-level dread wherever they went. The church, naturally, had opinions. Priests recommended confession, holy water, and if all else failed, digging up the body and giving it another, more thorough burial. Peasants took that advice creatively. They'd drive stakes through corpses, tie them face down, or stuff their mouths with stones just to make sure the dearly departed stayed more departed than usual. It sounds grim, but remember, this was a world without Netflix. Digging up a suspected ghost was practically community theater. There are recorded cases where entire parishes attended, bringing torches, prayers, and snacks. Someone would inevitably say, "Wait, what if it wakes up?" And then everyone would laugh nervously and stand slightly further away. And yet, behind the absurdity lay genuine fear. When your crops failed or your cow stopped producing milk, you didn't blame bad weather. You blamed Uncle Jeffrey, who clearly wasn't resting peacefully. If a child got sick, maybe it was the ghost of an unbaptized infant seeking warmth. If the wind howled too long, maybe souls were trapped in it, whispering regrets through the thatch. Every sound, every flicker could mean something supernatural, which frankly made medieval nights terrible for light sleepers. But even amid the fear, there was tenderness. Many families left food for the wandering dead, lit candles to guide them home, or whispered prayers by hearthlight. The boundary between life and death wasn't solid. It was porous, like fog, something you could almost touch if you dared. And that, in a way, is what made medieval Halloween so human. Beneath the superstition and the grave digging, there was longing for connection, for remembrance, for the hope that love might outlast the body. So next time you see a Halloween decoration that looks suspiciously lifelike, remember, it all began with people who believed their loved ones could still walk beside them, not in a zombie apocalypse way, just in a "please don't rattle the windows tonight" way. Now take a slow breath. The fire crackles softly. The dead have settled for now. But our story is just beginning, because where there are restless ghosts, there are restless humans trying to make sense of them. If you've ever carved a pumpkin and thought, "This is kind of gross," congratulations. You share a noble tradition with your medieval ancestors. Except, of course, they didn't have pumpkins. They had turnips. Picture a hard, knobbly beetroot-like vegetable, small enough to fit in one hand, difficult enough to carve that it could ruin your marriage. People in the Middle Ages hollowed these out, stuck candles inside, and placed them in windows to scare away evil spirits. The result? A flickering, shrunken face that looked less spooky and more culinary accident. But back then, that was the height of home security. The turnip lantern, or Jack of the Lantern, guarded doors, barns, and occasionally chickens. If it didn't frighten spirits, it at least made burglars question their life choices. Of course, no Halloween, or Samhain, as the Celts called it, was complete without a bonfire. Not a cheerful marshmallow roasting fire, but a roaring, smoke-choking inferno built on a sacred hill. Whole communities gathered, wrapped in cloaks and anxiety, to light torches from the same flame. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was purification. It cleansed the land, drove away disease, and roasted any lingering evil that dared to drift too close. As sparks flew into the night, villagers would leap through the flames for luck or for show. If you tripped, that was bad news. If your cloak caught fire, even worse. But if you made it across safely, you could brag about it until next harvest. It was the medieval version of CrossFit, except instead of fitness, you were proving to Death himself that you were nimble enough to postpone your appointment. Meanwhile, the church frowned upon these pagan parties, but cleverly decided to rename them. Samhain became All Hallows' Eve. Bonfires became Holy Lights. And everyone politely ignored the fact that people were still burning hay effigies shaped suspiciously like local tax collectors. The night was thick with omens. If your candle went out, it meant a ghost had entered the room. If your dog howled, someone nearby was about to die. And if your beer went flat, well, that was just England. Still, amid the smoke and superstition, something beautiful flickered, a shared hope that light, no matter how small, could push back the dark. It didn't matter whether you were a noble praying in a chapel or a farmer waving a flaming stick at the sky. Everyone, in their own smoky way, was saying the same thing. Please, not this year. Let the sun come back. So next time you light a candle or stare into a jack-o'-lantern's glow, remember that once upon a time people gathered under the same October sky, clutching turnips and prayers, believing that maybe, just maybe, fire could keep the night from swallowing them whole. And maybe, in a way, it still does. Every era has its villains. In the Middle Ages, it was easy: famine, plague, and women who could read. These, apparently, were the main signs of witchcraft. Witches were blamed for everything that went wrong: spoiled milk, sudden storms, bad harvests, even stubbed toes. If something unfortunate happened, and there was a woman nearby who owned herbs, a cat, or confidence, congratulations! You had a witch on your hands. Most so-called witches weren't the broomstick-flying, lightning-throwing kind. They were midwives, herbalists, and healers, people who actually helped their communities. But in a world that feared what it couldn't explain, helping too much was suspicious. Cure a fever once, and you were a miracle worker. Cure it twice, and you were clearly in league with the devil. Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve, became the night when people imagined these witches gathering in forests, dancing around fires, and plotting mischief. In truth, most medieval women were too busy hauling water, baking bread, and not dying of dysentery to host satanic dance parties. But imagination fills gaps where logic should be. The church capitalized on this fear. Sermons warned that witches consorted with demons, stole babies, and turned into animals. Artists painted them flying naked through the night sky, which frankly sounds like a health hazard in a 14th century winter. To the medieval mind, the world was alive with unseen forces. Every cough might be a curse. Every shadow could hide temptation. And women, being terrifyingly mysterious, made the perfect scapegoats. Even simple herbal remedies came under suspicion. Willow bark tea, witchcraft, mint for stomach pain, devil's brew, wearing garlic. Practical, but also suspiciously effective. Some villages took no chances. On Halloween night, they hung iron charms, sprinkled salt on doorsteps, and recited prayers backwards to confuse any evil listener. If someone's cat happened to sneeze mid-chant, that was basically a written confession. And yet, beneath all the fear, something human remained. Witches, in a strange way, were respected too. People feared them, but they also sought them out when crops failed or lovers strayed. The witch was both danger and necessity, someone who walked the edge between natural and supernatural, between comfort and chaos. It's easy now to laugh at their paranoia, but maybe we haven't changed that much. Every era invents new witches. We still blame unseen forces when life feels out of control. We just call them algorithms now. So next time you see a Halloween witch with her crooked hat and broom, remember, once upon a time, that costume represented someone's genuine terror and someone else's quiet defiance. She wasn't the villain of the story. She was the survivor. Now, let's head deeper into the shadows, where creatures howl, fires flicker, and medieval peasants debate whether that noise outside was the wind or something older. Chapter 5. Castles and Candlelight. Vigilance. Castles look majestic now, grey stone, banners fluttering, the stuff of fairy tales. But in the Middle Ages they were drafty anxiety boxes full of creaking wood, suspicious draughts, and people pretending not to hear ghosts. Imagine a cold October night inside a fortress. The torches flicker along the corridors, throwing nervous shadows on damp stone walls. A servant swears he saw someone in the great hall, someone who wasn't on the payroll. The dog refuses to go near the stairwell, and upstairs the lord of the manor lies awake, clutching his rosary like it's a medieval nightlight. Halloween, or rather All Hallows' Eve, was not a night for resting easy. The wealthy had thicker walls, but they also had bigger ghosts, dead knights, wronged lovers, and ancestors with opinions. It was tradition to leave candles burning in castle windows, guiding friendly spirits home and warning the cranky ones to keep moving. If you were especially cautious, you'd sprinkle holy water on your threshold, hang garlic above the door, and tell the staff not to whistle, because apparently demons love whistling. Even the bravest guards weren't immune. Picture two of them standing at the gate, spears trembling slightly. One says, "Did you hear that?" The other says, "No." They both stare into the fog for 5 minutes anyway, pretending to see nothing because seeing something would mean extra work. It was a tough job, guarding a building everyone assumed was already haunted. Then came the bells, deep, echoing tones rolling across the countryside. Churches rang them to scare away evil, but from inside a castle the sound felt closer, almost inside the walls. Some swore that when the bells tolled past midnight, you could hear faint laughter echoing in the rafters, the ancestors finding the whole thing hilarious. Still, life went on. The kitchens baked soul cakes, the chapel filled with prayers, and someone inevitably tripped over a suit of armor left standing in the dark. For all their grandeur, medieval castles were noisy, cramped, and filled with people who believed that a draught might actually be Satan. And yet, the flicker of those candles meant something deeper, a belief that the light of faith, however dim, could keep out the unknown. It was comfort wrapped in ritual. If you could see the flame, you weren't alone. So tonight, as you picture that lonely castle on a hill, remember that every stone once trembled with stories of knights and nuns, love and loss, and maybe one poor servant who just wanted to refill the torches before something whispered his name. If there's one thing scarier than ghosts, it's germs you can't see, especially in a century where people thought sanitation meant washing once per lifetime and hoping for divine intervention. Welcome to the age of plague, panic, and prayers delivered via candlelight. Halloween in the time of the Black Death was less trick-or-treat and more don't breathe near me. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost nearly half its population. The line between life and death blurred so badly that people stopped asking if ghosts were real and started asking how to file complaints about them. Villages emptied overnight. Graveyards overflowed. Entire streets were silent except for the sound of church bells and distant coughing. To cope, people turned to ritual. Bonfires were lit to purify the air. Bells rang endlessly to chase away the plague spirits. Even sweet-smelling herbs were burned in doorways, because if the dead were walking, at least the house could smell nice. And of course, someone always found a way to make it worse. Rumors spread that witches, Jews, or foreigners had cursed the wells. Towns erupted in panic. Crowds marched through the streets, whipping themselves in repentance, a kind of traveling horror show where the moral was always, "God's angry. Better hit yourself harder." The church tried to help, but theology wasn't great at germ theory. Priests blessed corpses until they became corpses themselves. Halloween, in those plague years, wasn't celebration. It was coping. Lighting a candle wasn't symbolic. It was desperate. Every flicker was a prayer that tomorrow's list of the dead wouldn't include your name. And yet, amidst all the terror, there was resilience. People still sang hymns. They still carved grotesque faces into turnips to scare away death. They still shared stories by the fire, tales where death could be fooled or bargained with, even if just for one more harvest. It's hauntingly human, that instinct to laugh in the dark, to tell jokes about the reaper while he's practically standing at the door. Maybe that's why Halloween survived, because it gave shape to fear, turned it into ritual, and made the unthinkable somehow manageable. Of course, the pumpkin wouldn't join the story for centuries, a cheerful orange immigrant from the New World. Medieval Europeans had no idea what they were missing. If you showed them a modern jack-o'-lantern, they'd probably scream, assume it was possessed, and try to bury it in consecrated ground. But that's the beauty of history. What once terrified us becomes decoration. So next time you see a smiling pumpkin on a porch, remember, it's not just cute. It's the ghost of all those turnips, candles, and trembling prayers, reborn, glowing, and blissfully unaware of fleas. Now take a breath. The fires are still burning, the bells are still ringing, and the night hasn't ended yet. Because where the plague went, fear followed. And where fear went, stories always bloomed. If you lived in medieval Europe, you didn't need Spotify. You had church bells. They rang for births, deaths, weddings, fires, invasions, lost sheep, and sometimes just because the bell ringer was bored. But on Halloween night, those bells tolled for something far older, to keep the dead where they belonged. The belief was simple. Evil spirits hated noise. So the louder your bells, the fewer uninvited guests from the afterlife. Villagers gathered near the church tower, listening as the great bronze mouths called into the darkness. Boom! Boom! Each echo pushing against the unseen. The sound rolled over hills, through forests, across graveyards. For a few moments, everyone felt protected, because if the bells were ringing, the world was still orderly. The living were still winning. Of course, this peace came at a price. Some poor soul had to climb that tower in the middle of the night, surrounded by cold stone and colder air, to ring those bells by hand. Many bell ringers swore they heard voices whispering between tolls. Names they knew, footsteps behind them, even laughter. And if you stopped ringing, the wind would start up, moaning through cracks, rattling the ropes, mimicking the dead. In some villages, People left offerings for the bell ringers, a loaf of bread, a flask of ale, or a promise of forgiveness in case they accidentally woke the wrong spirit. Because if anyone was going to be haunted, it would be the guy making all that noise. The church officially called it the passing bell, a symbol of prayer and order. But villagers called it soul rattling. Not because it rattled souls away, but because it rattled theirs inside. Imagine the deep vibration of metal in your chest, the feeling that each toll shakes something unseen loose. By the 10th ring, you're praying. By the 20th, you're regretting every sin since birth. And yet, it worked, or at least people believed it did. The night would pass, the dawn would rise, and the graves would stay politely shut. Superstition or not, the bells became a comfort. They were a promise that the living still had a voice, one loud enough to reach heaven, or at least to drown out the whispering underfoot. So if you ever hear church bells echo through fog or rain, think of those sleepless monks and trembling villagers, trying to hold back the dark with nothing but bronze and faith. Each toll was a heartbeat, each echo a defiance. And somewhere out there, a ghost probably sighed and said, "Fine, maybe tomorrow." The church, as always, had a plan. And like most medieval plans, it began with good intentions and ended in mild chaos. Originally, All Hallows' Eve wasn't supposed to be scary. It was the prelude to All Saints' Day, a time to honor holy men and women who had achieved divine VIP status. The next day, All Souls' Day, was for everyone else. The ordinary, mildly sinful folks still stuck in purgatory waiting for processing. In theory, it was beautiful. In practice, it turned into the first medieval neighborhood watch program for ghosts. People believed that souls in purgatory could visit Earth once a year to ask for prayers, snacks, or both. So, naturally, villagers started baking small round buns called soul cakes, sweet little bribes with raisins. You'd give one to anyone who came knocking, usually children or beggars dressed in cloaks, in exchange for a prayer for your dead relatives. It was part charity, part insurance policy. You never knew who was under that hood. Maybe a hungry kid. Maybe Great-Aunt Mildred back from the grave. Best to hand over the pastry, just in case. It was, essentially, trick-or-treating before marketing departments existed. Kids went door to door, singing solemn songs about salvation while secretly competing to see who could eat the most cakes before vomiting. Adults pretended it was a holy act, but everyone knew it was the best night of the year. Free food and mild blasphemy, the medieval dream. Of course, not everyone approved. Some priests warned that souling, as it was called, blurred the line between devotion and indulgence. Others shrugged and joined in. After all, who could resist cinnamon and forgiveness baked into one convenient snack? And so, All Hallows' Eve became a peculiar mixture of celebration and sorrow. People prayed for the dead, laughed with the living, and occasionally mistook the two. The night was full of disguises, some to honor the saints, others to confuse spirits who might drag you into the afterlife early. The logic was, if a ghost can't tell you from itself, you're safe. It's the same reasoning people use when dressing like their co-workers at Halloween parties. Safety through confusion. Over time, these traditions tangled together, pagan bonfires, Christian prayers, superstitious snacks. The result was a night that no one fully understood, but everyone participated in. A night when the church preached salvation, and the peasants said, "Cool, but how many soul cakes are we allowed to eat?" And perhaps that's why it endured. Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve, was never just about fear. It was about belonging, remembering the dead, feeding the hungry, laughing in the dark. It was messy, noisy, heartfelt, everything human history tends to be. So as you imagine those smoky streets filled with flickering candles and sticky-fingered children, take comfort in knowing we've always been the same. We still bake, we still disguise, we still whisper to the past. And somewhere, a medieval baker is smiling because he started all this with nothing but dough, faith, and a really good excuse to eat dessert at midnight. If you've ever worn a Halloween costume and thought, this is ridiculous, congratulations. You're honoring a 1,000-year-old tradition of bad decisions in the name of safety. In the Middle Ages, people believed that on All Hallows' Eve, the barrier between worlds got thinner, like a badly patched roof in a rainstorm. Spirits could slip through, looking for warmth, food, or a body to borrow for the night. Naturally, humans came up with the perfect countermeasure: pretend to be one of them. Yes, the very first Halloween costumes were not about creativity or selfies. They were camouflage. Peasants smeared soot on their faces, draped themselves in animal skins, and walked the roads pretending to be ghosts, goblins, or things that went ugh in the dark. The logic was simple. If death came knocking, you wanted him to think you were already on his payroll. Some historians even believe that masks had practical uses. In certain parts of Scotland and Ireland, people called geysers would dress up and visit neighbors' homes, offering blessings in exchange for food. If they weren't given anything, they might mutter a few curses instead. The prototype for trick or treat, minus the mini Snickers and plus actual witchcraft threats. The disguises weren't glamorous. Think less sexy vampire and more muddy villager with 2 sheep hides and a stick. The goal wasn't to look pretty. It was to look questionable enough that the undead gave you a respectful nod and moved on. Over time, the tradition evolved. Towns held small plays called mumming or souling, where actors dressed as devils, angels, or skeletons reenacted moral stories for donations of food and beer. It was like dinner theater, except everyone was starving and slightly afraid of eternal damnation. The church, predictably, tried to supervise. If you must dress up, priests would sigh, at least make it educational. So saints, martyrs, and biblical characters joined the lineup, alongside the occasional farmer who just wanted to wear goat horns for fun. And then there was the sound. Imagine the streets filled with the shuffle of straw, laughter echoing through fog, and the distant tolling of bells. Flames flicker in carved turnips, faces half hidden behind ragged masks. It's eerie, but not frightening, a strange kind of fellowship in fear. Because under the soot and skins, everyone was saying the same thing. We know the dark is real, but tonight we'll laugh at it together. So next time you zip up your Halloween costume, remember, you're not just dressing up. You're participating in a 1,000-year-old magic trick, pretending not to be afraid, until you actually aren't. Every great holiday starts as a marketing problem. Halloween's story is no exception. Long before Christianity arrived, the Celts celebrated Samhain, a festival marking the end of harvest and the start of winter. It was a practical event with impractical guests, spirits, fairies, and gods who wandered freely through the mortal world for one night. Fires were lit on hillsides, cattle were herded home, and everyone hoped to make it through the dark months without frostbite or divine mischief. But when the church expanded into Celtic lands, it faced a dilemma. How do you convince an entire population To stop throwing bonfires for invisible fairies. Simple, you rebrand. Around the 8th century, Pope Gregory III moved All Saints' Day to November 1st, right after Samhain, hoping people would trade in their pagan fire festivals for something more heavenly. It worked beautifully, sort of. The people kept the bonfires, the feasts, and the spooky folklore. They just added saints and prayers to the guest list. Basically, medieval people invented religious multitasking. Soon, the night before All Saints' Day became All Hallows' Eve, which later slurred into Halloween. It was the same celebration dressed in church-approved robes. Saints replaced spirits, candles replaced bonfires, and priests replaced druids. Though both groups had impressive robes and mysterious chants, still traces of the old ways lingered. People left offerings of food outside for wandering souls. They believed fairies could steal humans on this night. A terrifying thought, unless you were someone who really needed a vacation. Farmers watched the skies for omens. If you saw a shooting star, it meant a soul had escaped purgatory. If you saw two, it meant you should probably stay indoors and pray harder. Despite centuries of sermons, Samhain refused to die. It simply learned Latin. The church eventually accepted this and leaned into the aesthetic. Processions replaced druidic circles. Prayers replaced pagan chants. The core idea remained. The dead are near, winter is coming, and humanity should probably panic in an organized fashion. By the late Middle Ages, Halloween was a strange hybrid. Part religion, part folklore, part, please don't curse my crops. It was neither pagan nor purely Christian, but something wonderfully human, an annual negotiation with the unknown. And maybe that's why it still works. Every culture finds its own version of Samhain, a day to light candles, honor ancestors, and laugh at shadows. The names change, the costumes evolve, but the feeling stays the same. It's the quiet understanding that the dark isn't our enemy, it's our oldest neighbor. So as we leave the Celts and their bonfires behind, let's step into a medieval village once more, where stories of ghosts and monsters travel faster than the wind, and everyone's just trying to keep their candle lit until morning. Before TikTok, before Netflix, before even books most people could read, there was storytelling. And in medieval Europe, storytelling after dark was a full-contact sport. Picture a cold October evening in a one-room cottage. Smoke curls up through a hole in the roof. The only light comes from the fire, flickering over faces lined by work and worry. Outside, the wind moans through the fields. Inside, a grandmother clears her throat and says the 7 words guaranteed to make every child sit still. Let me tell you about the ghost. These weren't the cartoonish kind of ghosts with chains and moans. Medieval spirits had personality. There was the farmer who came back to finish his chores, the monk who haunted the abbey because someone misplaced his skull, the headless knight looking for his helmet, and possibly his dignity. Each region had its favorites, but the message was universal. Respect the dead, or they'll make sure you don't get much sleep. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was insurance. Tales carried warnings disguised as entertainment. Don't steal, warned one story, or a demon will sit on your chest forever. Don't skip church, said another, or you'll wander the graveyard coughing up soot. The moral structure was clear, if slightly extreme. The best storytellers, often the village elders, knew exactly how to pace their words. Long pauses, crackling fire, a log collapsing at just the right moment to make everyone gasp, then a chuckle, a sip of ale, and a reminder that the ghost was last seen just over there, by the mill. Of course, not every ghost was scary. Some were funny, some sad, some surprisingly polite. One popular tale from the 13th century describes a ghost who returned home just to scold his wife for bad housekeeping. Another claimed a spirit politely waited outside until invited in. Proof that even death couldn't break medieval manners. By the end of the night, the fire would burn low, the laughter would fade, and someone would whisper, "What was that noise?" Everyone would go silent, listening to the creak of the rafters, the hiss of the embers. Then someone would nervously laugh, a laugh just a little too high, a little too quick, and the stories would begin again. Maybe that's what kept the darkness at bay. Not the holy water or the bells, but the voices, the shared warmth, the laughter that said, "We may not understand the night, but we're facing it together." So tonight, if you hear a strange sound or catch a flicker in the corner of your eye, don't panic. Just imagine an old woman smiling by the fire, telling another story to keep you awake or help you sleep. Either way, you're in good company. Every culture needs monsters. The Middle Ages had plenty, but few were as real or as terrifying as the wolf. To modern ears, wolves sound romantic, moonlight, wilderness, maybe a moody violin. But to medieval villagers, wolves were the stuff of nightmares. They prowled the edges of civilization, silent and starving. A single harsh winter could bring them howling right up to the walls of a settlement. And when they came, they didn't just take livestock. They took stories. In the dark months, people whispered about men who could turn into wolves. Werewolves, though that word came later. Some said it was a curse, others a punishment for sin. If you stayed out too late, or if your shadow looked too long in the moonlight, you might be accused of harboring the wolf within. And if a villager went missing during a full moon, well, let's just say the next night's dinner conversation got awkward. Priests told their flocks that wolves represented the devil, always circling, always hungry. But peasants had a more practical take. Wolves were just nature reminding you that you were made of meat. Still, fear has a way of breeding imagination. People swore they saw giant wolves with glowing eyes stalking the fields. Hunters found paw prints that turned into human footprints halfway across the snow. Even the sound of a dog barking in the distance could make hearts race, because everyone knew deep down that the line between man and beast was thinner than anyone liked to admit. By the 14th century, Europe was crawling with tales of shapeshifters. Some were tragic. Men cursed to roam the woods until forgiven by God. Others were pure gossip. I saw old Henry eating raw mutton behind the barn, definitely a wolf now. And then there were the legal cases. Yes, actual trials, complete with judges, witnesses, and occasionally defendants who are goats. You haven't lived until you've read a court transcript where a man insists under oath that he only felt like a wolf but didn't actually bite anyone. Behind all the absurdity lay something deeply human, a fear of losing control, of turning wild. When the nights grew long and the forests whispered, people saw reflections of themselves in the eyes of the wolf. The hunger, the rage, the survival. It wasn't just outside the walls. It was inside, too. So when you hear a distant howl, don't be afraid. Or do a little. Because for medieval people, that sound wasn't just an animal call. It was a reminder that civilization is just a thin fence around something ancient and untamed. The wolves always waited at the edge of the firelight, and maybe, in a way, they still do. If the Middle Ages had an economy based on fear, relics were its currency. Every village wanted protection from demons, plagues, and suspicious drafts, and nothing said divine coverage like a splinter of Saint Somebody's femur. Relics, bones, teeth, hair, even bits of clothing from saints, were spiritual insurance policies. The holier and weirder the relic, the better your odds of surviving October. But here's the problem. There weren't nearly enough saints to meet demand. So, as in all great capitalist systems, creative supply chains emerged. By the 12th century, Europe was awash in relics. Monasteries claimed to have the true cross, all 40 of them. One church boasted 3 separate heads of John the Baptist. Another sold shavings from St. Peter's beard, which was remarkable, considering he'd been dead for a millennium and reportedly clean-shaven. Pilgrims bought small fragments encased in gold, proudly taking home their portable holiness. It was the medieval version of souvenir shopping, except your magnet could ward off the apocalypse. Halloween season was peak business. Villagers paid to borrow relics for processions, hoping they'd keep evil spirits at bay. Holy bones were carried through fields, waved over sick livestock, or dangled near suspicious neighbors. If the harvest went well, people said, "Thank God for the relic." If it failed, well, clearly the relic needed upgrading. Of course, not every relic was authentic. There were fakes, lots of them. Traveling merchants sold blessed dust, which was just dust, and blood of the martyrs, which was not. But people believed anyway, because belief, not bone, was what mattered. A scrap of linen could protect a household if you treated it like a miracle. For the clergy, relics also solved a major PR problem. Instead of telling terrified peasants that death is inevitable, priests could say, "Death is avoidable," for a modest donation. And people paid happily, not just for the relics themselves, but for the feeling that maybe, just maybe, heaven was listening. There's something touching in that desperation, that willingness to see holiness in the tiniest fragment, to believe that something sacred could fit in the palm of your hand. Because the truth was, the relics didn't protect people from ghosts or plague or famine. They protected them from despair. So as you drift off tonight, imagine those candle-lit churches filled with glittering reliquaries, glass boxes holding bones and hopes alike. The bells toll softly, the faithful whisper prayers, and somewhere a monk counts coins and thinks, at least business is good. If medieval Halloween had a celebrity, it was the village soothsayer, that mysterious figure who could see the future using nothing more than smoke, vegetables, and supreme confidence. Every community had one. Sometimes she was an old woman with a reputation for knowing things she shouldn't. Sometimes he was a wandering mystic with an unsettling stare. Most were herbalists, healers, or just very observant people who knew that if someone bought a lot of candles in October, a funeral was probably coming. October was their peak season, the spiritual tax season of the Middle Ages. People lined up with questions about everything from love to livestock. Will I marry this year? Will my cow survive the winter? Is my husband possessed or just lazy? For a small fee, the soothsayer would consult runes, herbs, or occasionally a suspiciously dramatic bowl of water. Divination methods varied. Some gazed into mirrors or polished metal, the earliest medieval version of doom scrolling. Others burned herbs and read the shapes in the smoke. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, girls peeled apples and tossed the skins over their shoulders, hoping the curls would spell out the initials of their future husband. And if the peel spelled nothing at all, congratulations, you were probably destined for convent life. On Halloween night, the veil between worlds was considered thinnest, the perfect time for peeking into destiny's inbox. The soothsayer might perform rituals with candles, chanting prayers half Christian, half pagan. People watched, wide-eyed, as shadows danced on the walls. If the candle flickered, it meant the spirit world was listening. If it went out, it meant, well, you should probably move. For the church, this was problematic. Officially, fortune-telling was forbidden, dabbling in demonic power. Unofficially, even priests sometimes asked for a quick peek at next year's weather. And so, the soothsayer existed in a strange limbo, feared, respected, tolerated, and occasionally dunked in a pond if her predictions went wrong. But year after year, people still came, because uncertainty is scarier than any ghost. Beneath the theatrics and superstition lay something deeply human, a craving for control. When crops failed, when children fell ill, when the nights felt too long, people turned to anyone who could offer even the illusion of order. A whisper of hope was better than silence. So tonight, imagine a flickering hut at the edge of a village. Herbs hang from the rafters. A single candle burns low. A soothsayer closes her eyes, murmurs something unintelligible, and tells you, you will live long and die warm. It's vague, it's comforting, and it's exactly what you needed to hear, because sometimes even false certainty can chase away the dark. Before fun-size candy bars, there were soul cakes, small, round buns flavored with nutmeg, cinnamon, and a pinch of theology. The tradition began in England around the Middle Ages. On All Hallows' Eve and All Souls' Day, people baked these sweet little offerings to give to travelers, beggars, and children who came knocking, promising prayers for the souls of the dead in return. It was part charity, part superstition, and part early marketing. One cake equals one less ghost haunting your family this winter. Picture a village street on a cold autumn night. Smoke drifts from chimneys. Candles glow behind small wooden shutters. Children in ragged cloaks go door to door, singing in their thin voices, a soul, for a soul cake. Please, good missus, a soul cake." Each bun given meant one soul freed from purgatory, or so people hoped. Families baked dozens, not out of generosity, but out of cautious mathematics. If you had 15 dead relatives and handed out 12 cakes, you were still 3 prayers short of a reunion. The cakes themselves were simple: flour, butter, sugar, sometimes currants or honey if the harvest had been kind. The cross, baked into the top, wasn't decoration. It was divine branding. Villagers stacked them by the door, next to the candles and turnip lanterns, ready to exchange pastry for piety. It sounds sweet and quaint now, but it carried real emotional weight. Death was everywhere in medieval life. Families kept lists of the departed. Names were read aloud at church. Prayers for the dead filled the calendar. Soul cakes gave people a tangible way to help, a little hope baked in butter. Even the poorest could give or receive one and feel for a moment that heaven was listening. Of course, some people gamed the system. A few professional soulers made the rounds in multiple villages, collecting enough cakes to feed a small army of sinners. By morning they were stuffed, sanctified, and probably banned from at least 3 parishes. The church, naturally, approved at first. It encouraged acts of charity, after all. But when the festivities got too rowdy, with music, ale, and questionable theology. Priests began preaching against the heathenish revels, which, in medieval terms, meant everyone was having too much fun. Still, the custom endured, morphing over centuries into trick-or-treating. And maybe that's the charm of it, the quiet continuity between a medieval baker handing out soul cakes and a modern parent dropping candy into a plastic pumpkin. Both are small gestures of goodwill. Both say, "Here, take this. The night's dark, but we're all in it together." So next time you unwrap a chocolate bar on Halloween, take a moment for the bakers who came before. They didn't have caramel fillings, but they did have faith, butter, and a good reason to believe that kindness, even sugared kindness, could reach the other side. If you think ghost stories are scary, imagine being the guy whose job was literally living in a graveyard. Medieval monasteries were peaceful by day, stone cloisters echoing with chants, sunlight spilling across manuscripts. But by night, they became echo chambers for every creak, sigh, and phantom prayer you could imagine. And monks, bless them, had overactive imaginations. They slept in narrow cells, alone, with only the sound of wind and the occasional reminder that the building was full of dead people. Cemeteries surrounded the abbey walls, and crypts ran beneath the floors. Every step after dark echoed like someone following you, politely but persistently. Rumors spread quickly. One monk saw a shadow walking between the pews. Another swore he heard chanting from an empty chapel. And Brother Matthew once claimed that the Virgin Mary appeared to him, only for the abbot to discover it was just Brother Stephen wearing a bedsheet and a guilty expression. The Church officially discouraged superstition, but unofficially it thrived. Medieval monks copied entire manuscripts on the dangers of demons, the temptations of spirits, and the proper Latin for "please go away." They believed in restless souls, spirits trapped between heaven and earth for sins unconfessed. And where better for such souls to wander than the hallways of an ancient monastery, where the living prayed for their release? Hauntings often had moral lessons attached. If a monk claimed to see a ghost, it was usually to remind everyone to fast harder, pray longer, or stop stealing extra bread from the kitchen. One 12th century story tells of a ghostly brother who appeared during evening prayers, sighing loudly until the abbot promised to recite 30 psalms on his behalf. Afterward, the ghost vanished, presumably to heaven, or perhaps just a quieter cloister. But fear made faith stronger. When lightning struck the bell tower, monks didn't call it bad luck. They called it divine feedback. Every creak in the rafters, every flicker of candlelight was a test of devotion. If you could walk through the crypt at midnight and not soil your habit, congratulations, sainthood pending. Still, the human side peeked through the solemnity. When a brother confessed he was afraid of the dark, others teased him by leaving skulls in his bed. When the abbey cat knocked over a candle, they spent a week fasting because they thought it was an omen. Behind all the rituals and fear was a kind of childlike awe, the sense that the world was alive with mystery. And maybe that's what made the monasteries special. They were built for prayer, but sustained by wonder, a fragile mix of fear and faith that kept men singing into the night, even when the wind whispered their names. So as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine the faint echo of chanting through stone corridors. Not haunting, just history humming softly in the dark. Long before Hollywood gave vampires perfect cheekbones and moral complexity, medieval Europe believed in them the old-fashioned way, bloated, smelly, and very bad at staying buried. The word vampire didn't exist yet, but the fear certainly did. In small villages from Transylvania to Yorkshire, people whispered about corpses that refused to behave. If someone died suddenly and the cows stopped producing milk, or if a family member started coughing mysteriously, you could bet someone was digging up Uncle Radolph by sunrise. You see, medieval folks had a problem with post-mortem science. When they reopened graves, bodies sometimes looked suspiciously fresh. Skin was pink, hair and nails seemed longer, and there might even be blood around the mouth. To us, that's just decomposition. To them, evidence that the deceased had been sneaking out at night for a midnight snack. The solution was, in a word, aggressive. They'd hammer stakes through the corpse, chop off heads, or fill the mouth with rocks to prevent chewing. In one English village, they even found a skeleton buried with its legs broken and a brick wedged in its jaw. History's least glamorous dental procedure. Church records show priests being called in to re-sanctify cemeteries where too many bodies were rumored to stir. But not all vampires were villains. Some stories spoke of friendly revenants who visited loved ones to comfort them or warn of danger. Imagine that, showing up unannounced, half-decayed, just to tell your cousin to avoid the bad fish vendor in town. These legends traveled fast, evolving as they went. In Slavic countries, the Upior or Nosferatu was a restless soul cursed for impiety. In Western Europe, it was often linked to demonic possession or improper burial, and while scholars tried to reason it all out, the peasants didn't wait. They grabbed shovels and got proactive. The irony: most of these early vampires were victims of contagious diseases like tuberculosis. The coughing, the blood at the lips, the wasting away, all real, all terrifying. But to a world without microscopes, the simplest explanation was the most horrifying one. Someone dead was doing this. So when you see a movie vampire brooding in a candlelit castle, remember, his medieval ancestors were swollen corpses that smelled like disappointment and superstition. No romance, no velvet, just panic, garlic, and a lot of unnecessary digging. Yet there's something strangely touching about it, this desperate attempt to explain what the living couldn't understand. The vampire wasn't just a monster. It was grief with teeth, a symbol of the ache that death leaves behind, and the haunting suspicion that love or hunger might outlast the grave. So sleep easy. If something knocks at your window tonight, it's probably just the wind. Probably, while monks prayed and peasants panicked, another kind of Halloween entertainment roamed the countryside, the mummers. Think of them as medieval theater troupes or chaotic street performers who didn't wait to be invited inside. Every autumn, groups of villagers dressed in costumes, sometimes animal masks, sometimes rags, sometimes whatever they could find that didn't smell like last week's stew, and went from house to house performing short plays. They'd sing, dance, act out moral lessons, and occasionally insult the host in rhyme. In return, they got ale, bread, or coins. If you refused to pay, the jokes got meaner. It was part performance, part extortion, and everyone pretended to enjoy it. Mumming plays often featured stock characters: Death, the devil, a doctor, and a hero who inevitably killed Death in the finale, only for the doctor to revive him with a potion that was clearly just ale. It was slapstick theology at its finest. Medieval audiences loved it. Where else could you see Death himself get defeated by a man in a potato sack? For one night, the social order inverted. Farmhands mocked lords, women dressed as men, Monks danced, everyone hid behind masks, laughing at their own mortality, a perfect prelude to All Saints' Day, when they'd all be serious again and pray for forgiveness. Some towns took it further, hosting grand pageants called souling plays, where entire villages participated. The performances mixed Christian symbolism with pagan flair, devils chasing saints, angels battling skeletons, and at least one guy dressed as a giant vegetable. It was half sermon, half circus. The church tolerated it, barely. Priests complained that mummers encouraged worldly delight. Yet even bishops admitted that laughter, in small doses, was good for the soul. After all, if the devil hates joy, what better way to defeat him than by throwing a really weird party? Behind the humor, though, the plays carried wisdom. They reminded people that life and death, good and evil, were all part of the same story, and that even in the bleakest winter, a little foolishness could keep the darkness at bay. So, if you ever feel silly for laughing at something morbid, remember the mummers. They faced death with a joke, hunger with a song, and the apocalypse with interpretive dance. And somehow, that was enough. If there was one thing medieval people feared more than ghosts, it was running out of candles before midnight. Light wasn't just practical, it was holy. Candles were blessed in churches, used in rituals, and burned at the bedsides of the dying. Every flicker carried meaning, every shadow, suspicion. It was believed that a candle flame could reveal more than it illuminated. If the flame burned steady, it meant peace in the home. If it sputtered or turned blue, spirits were near. If it went out suddenly, especially without a draught, someone gasped, someone crossed themselves, and someone else whispered, "Don't move." Candles were so central to medieval life that entire economies revolved around them. Monasteries made them from beeswax. Poorer homes used tallow, animal fat that smoked, stank, and probably invited more spirits than it repelled. The wealthy bought tall, sweet-smelling candles that burned clean and slow. The poor made do with greasy lumps that flickered like nervous hearts. During All Hallows' Eve, every household lit candles for the departed, one for each soul they remembered. Windows glowed across the village, turning the darkness into a trembling constellation of grief and faith. And if one candle guttered out too soon, everyone noticed. Superstition filled the gap where science should have been. A candle that refused to light meant the devil was nearby. A candle that relit itself meant a ghost had accepted your invitation. And a dripping candle was said to mimic the tears of purgatory, heaven's sad little candle emoji. But for all the fear, there was comfort too. Light, however fragile, meant control. It meant the night could be pushed back, even if just by inches. And so, candles became symbols of both life and defiance. Small, glowing declarations that said, "We're still here. We're still trying." The rituals were meticulous. When the final prayers were said, each flame was blown out clockwise, never counterclockwise, lest you invite something back in. Some families even spoke to the flame before extinguishing it. "Go safely, light, and take our prayers with you." It was faith, poetry, and pyromancy all at once. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, imagine that soft golden glow, trembling but steady. Each flicker is a heartbeat from centuries past, whispering the same quiet wish. Let the light last till morning. Every village had one. A crooked cottage on the edge of town, its roof sagging like an old man's sigh, its door slightly ajar. No one lived there. No one dared. Because everyone knew That's where it happened. What it was depended on the storyteller. Sometimes it was murder, sometimes a plague death, sometimes just someone who forgot to pay tithe and got spiritually evicted. Whatever the tale, the message was clear. Don't go poking around the abandoned house. Medieval people didn't need Zillow listings. They had gossip. The widow's cottage, cursed. The blacksmith's barn, haunted. The old mill, definitely home to a demon or at least a rat with ambition. Abandoned buildings were moral billboards, teaching everyone what not to do. Lazy, greedy, irreverent. That's how you end up as the next ghostly tenant. Children dared each other to throw stones at the windows, and immediately regretted it when something thumped back. Farmers swore they saw candlelight flickering through cracked shutters. Even the animals refused to go near. If your cow wandered too close and stopped giving milk, you didn't blame her. You blamed the ghost who didn't appreciate dairy products. But here's the strange thing. Every generation added its own twist. The story grew, decayed, then bloomed again. The haunted house wasn't just a warning anymore. It was entertainment, therapy, folklore. A shared shiver that made life in a hard world feel just a little less ordinary. And sometimes someone would move in anyway, usually a poor laborer with no choice. They'd patch the roof, sweep the floor, hang a cross over the door, and wait. And when nothing happened, people whispered, "Ah, the ghost must like them," which in medieval terms was the highest possible compliment. In truth, most haunted houses were just casualties of time, rot, neglect, the slow retreat of warmth. But people filled those empty spaces with stories, because emptiness itself was unbearable. Better a ghost than a silence. So when you walk past an old building and feel that twinge of curiosity, you're carrying the same instinct. To look into the dark and wonder, not what's there, but who was there before. Every creak, every chill breeze is history saying, someone once called this home. And somewhere, in a medieval village long gone, a storyteller by the fire is grinning, watching you imagine it all exactly as they hoped. Every village had its trickster, that one farmer or blacksmith who was too clever for his own good. And every Halloween, someone inevitably told the story of how one of them tried to cheat death, and sometimes succeeded. Temporarily. The most famous of these was Stingy Jack, the Irishman whose legend would one day give us the jack-o'-lantern. Jack was a drunk, a liar, and exactly the kind of man you'd expect to run into at closing time and think, this is going to be a story. One night, the devil himself came to collect Jack's soul, but Jack, being both terrified and inconveniently witty, convinced the devil to share one last drink before the trip. When the bill arrived, Jack suggested, naturally, that Satan pay. The devil refused, so Jack tricked him into turning into a coin to settle the debt. Jack immediately stuffed the coin into his pocket next to a silver cross, trapping the devil inside. Negotiations followed. In exchange for freedom, the devil promised not to claim Jack's soul for another 10 years. 10 years later, Jack did it again. He convinced the devil to climb a tree for an apple, then carved a cross into the bark so he couldn't come down. You'd think by now the Prince of Darkness would have learned about boundary issues. When Jack finally died, heaven wouldn't take him for obvious reasons, and hell couldn't by contract. So the devil, laughing, gave him a single burning coal to light his way through eternal darkness. Jack hollowed out a turnip, placed the ember inside, and began to wander, doomed but stylish. And so the Jack of the Lantern was born, a lonely soul seen by travelers on windy nights, forever searching for a place to rest. When Irish immigrants carried the tale to America centuries later, they replaced the humble turnip with the more available pumpkin. It glowed brighter, lasted longer, and smelled considerably better. But the moral stuck. You can outwit the devil, maybe, but not forever. Death has patience, and it doesn't mind waiting while you carve vegetables. Every culture had a version of Jack, the clever mortal who negotiated with the supernatural and lived or unlived to tell the tale. Because deep down, people wanted to believe they could bargain with fear, that maybe a smile, a joke, or a well-timed trick could make death hesitate, even for one more harvest. So the next time you light a pumpkin's grin, remember, that's not just decoration, it's defiance. A tiny orange reminder that humanity has always met the dark with fire and sarcasm. For most of the Middle Ages, Europe had never seen a pumpkin. The first ones wouldn't arrive until the 1500s, shipped from the Americas by explorers who apparently looked at these enormous orange vegetables and thought, yes, these will absolutely confuse everyone. Before that, the Europeans carved turnips, beets, or sometimes even hollowed out skulls, which admittedly didn't catch on commercially. But once pumpkins arrived, it was love at first carve. They were bright, round, easy to hollow, and far less likely to rot your knife hand with questionable turnip juice. If medieval peasants had known about pumpkins, they would have worshipped them as divine miracles of convenience. Big enough to feed a family, sturdy enough to store soup, and apparently magical enough to ward off spirits. It was the vegetable equivalent of a Swiss army knife. In North America, native peoples had long cultivated pumpkins as food and symbol. They roasted, dried, and even wove them into folklore about abundance and balance, themes that would have made perfect sense to superstitious Europeans. Instead, the pumpkin's fame began accidentally when Irish immigrants in the 1800s brought the story of Stingy Jack across the sea. Turnips were hard to find, so they carved what they had and discovered that pumpkins made excellent lanterns. Thus began the reign of the jack-o'-lantern as we know it, bright, grinning, slightly deranged looking. Every October, millions of people unknowingly reenact a pagan-Christian hybrid ritual involving agriculture, trickery, and international produce trade. Back in medieval times, of course, the idea of decorating with vegetables would have been laughable. Food was survival. Nobody was wasting good produce on aesthetics. But if you told a 14th century farmer that someday people would pay money to buy pumpkins, carve faces into them, and then throw them away, he'd probably faint, and then demand a cut of the profits. Still, the pumpkin fits Halloween perfectly. It's cheerful yet eerie, sturdy yet fleeting, a perfect metaphor for the season itself. For a few short weeks, it glows bright against the dark. Then quietly, it collapses back into the earth. A brief orange miracle, a reminder that even the things we hollow out can still shine. So next time you light a pumpkin's face, remember, it's more than decoration. It's a symbol carried through centuries of fear, faith, and a little bit of foolishness. Glowing proof that humanity has always tried to make peace with the night. And sometimes that peace comes in the shape of a smiling vegetable. For centuries, the church tried to banish Halloween, and for centuries Halloween politely ignored it. Eventually, even the priests gave up and decided to make the best of it. If you can't exorcise them, monetize them. The church's relationship with fear was complicated. On the one hand, terror filled pews. On the other, Too much fear led people straight to the village soothsayer, and that was bad for business. So a compromise was struck. Instead of forbidding spooky traditions, they rebranded them as moral lessons. Hauntings became parables, ghosts became warnings. If a spirit appeared, it wasn't just restless, it was educational. Medieval sermons were masterpieces of melodrama. Priests described purgatory as a vast, smoky waiting room where souls queued endlessly for forgiveness, like a celestial post office. Demons were portrayed as petty bureaucrats of sin, always lurking, always filing. And saints, the original customer service representatives, constantly intervening to speed up your eternal paperwork. All Hallows' Eve became a sanctioned time to reflect on mortality, to light candles for the dead, pray for mercy, and try not to laugh during the parts about eternal torment. Because even back then, people found comfort in pretending that rules existed, even for ghosts. The church began hosting vigils on Halloween night, all-night prayer marathons meant to outlast the darkness. Monks chanted psalms, villagers joined in, and somewhere in the back row, a few parishioners quietly dozed off, inventing the first recorded instance of sleeping through a sermon. It was, unintentionally, the birth of cozy horror. But here's the beautiful irony. While the church preached against fear, it also depended on it. Fear gave faith its urgency. The promise of salvation meant little without something to be saved from. So they and Halloween made peace. One offering redemption, the other a night to acknowledge that we all need it. By the late Middle Ages, Halloween wasn't rebellion anymore. It was ritualized catharsis, a night to laugh at the dark before returning to the light. The church had learned what every storyteller already knew. You can't defeat fear. You can only invite it in, give it a candle, and make sure it behaves itself. So next time you walk past a churchyard lit with jack-o'-lanterns, remember, what began as a pagan plea to the dead ended as a prayer for the living. Halloween didn't conquer the church, and the church didn't conquer Halloween. They simply learned to share the same shadow. Dawn comes slowly to the medieval world. The bonfires have burned down to ash. Candles sputter in windows. The night that once howled and whispered is finally quiet, exhausted, like a monster who partied too hard. The villagers wake to the chill of November air. The fields shimmer with frost. A few turnip lanterns still glow faintly on doorsteps, their carved faces sagging into sleepy smiles. Children pick at the crumbs of soul cakes. A cow moos in the distance, unbothered by all the ghosts that fail to appear. The world feels cleaner somehow, washed by smoke, fear, and faith. Inside the chapel, the priest rings the morning bell. It's All Saints' Day now, the celebration of everything pure and holy, conveniently scheduled after a night of mild chaos. Villagers file in, bleary-eyed but grateful, clutching candles that have burned all night. They pray for the souls of their ancestors, for good harvests, and for the strength not to drink so much mead next time. Outside, the graveyard glows with dew. The earth feels alive, not frightening, just full of quiet memory. For all the noise and superstition of the night before, this morning belongs to peace. The dead, it seems, are content, the living perhaps too. A few stragglers linger by the ashes of the bonfire. They poke at the embers, watching the smoke rise into the pale sky. Someone swears they can still see shapes in it, faces maybe. But no one feels afraid anymore. Because the great secret of Halloween isn't that it's about death, it's that it's about release. After months of work and worry, people faced the darkness, made peace with it, and survived another turning of the year. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? The fires, the prayers, the laughter, they all say the same thing. Life goes on. The monsters were always temporary. The morning always wins. So as dawn spreads gold across the thatched rooftops, the ghosts slip quietly away. The villagers smile into their cloaks, and somewhere a tired storyteller mutters, "Same time next year." The world exhales. The year begins anew. And for one more night, safely passed, humanity, weary, hopeful, absurd, earns its rest. And here we are, back where we began. The fires have cooled, the bells have stopped, and even the ghosts have finally gone to bed. You've wandered through centuries tonight, through fog and faith, through superstition and laughter, and somehow you've survived a medieval Halloween. Picture the scene now, a quiet village under a silver dawn. The air smells of ash and apple peel. The last candle flickers in a church window, stubbornly glowing against the light. Somewhere, a farmer stretches, a rooster complains, and the world remembers how to be ordinary again. You've met turnip lanterns carved with shaky hands. You've listened to monks praying through the night. You've shared a drink with stingy Jack, dodged werewolves, and laughed with mummers dancing badly on cobblestone streets. You've seen how the living made peace with the dead, not by fighting them, but by inviting them in for bread and song. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside all the nonsense. Halloween was never just about ghosts. It was about acceptance, about facing the dark with humor, warmth, and a little candle that says, "Not tonight, death." We're busy living. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine the world 700 years ago, the crackle of a dying fire, the sound of bells rolling over fields, the comfort of people huddled close, whispering stories they half believed, because believing made the night easier. Maybe we still do the same thing. Our ghosts just glow on screens now. Our bonfires are battery-powered. But the instinct's the same. Light something, share a laugh, and hope morning finds us still here. So let the past tuck you in. The turnips, the saints, the witches, the wolves. They're all quiet now. And somewhere out there, in some endless medieval dreamscape, a small flame still burns in a window, just for you. Because history doesn't sleep. It hums softly, like a lullaby with a few cobwebs on it. And before you fade completely, a gentle reminder from your favorite sleepy historian. If you enjoyed tonight's wandering through haunted history, give the video a like, not for me, but for the algorithmic ghost who feeds on engagement. Subscribe too, so next time we dig through another dusty corner of the past, you'll already have your lantern lit. Until then, may your dreams be warm, your ghosts be friendly, and your candlelight last just long enough to reach the morning. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, and don't let the medieval ghosts bite.